Inflation sucks. But imagine a scenario where the International Monetary Fund, IMF, predicts that the inflation rate in your country is going to hit 1,000,000% this year. This is the story of Venezuela, a country whose currency Bolivar ended up losing 99.99% value against the US dollar. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world, holds 303 billion barrels to be exact. This is even more than Saudi Arabia. You'd expect the country to be rich and developed. But paradoxically, the blessing became a curse. The country fell victim to an economic phenomenon called resource curse, or Dutch disease. This happens when an economy becomes overly reliant on a single source, in this case, oil. Before oil dominated the economy, Venezuela had a diverse and largely agricultural economy. In the early 20th century, it was one of the wealthier nations in Latin America, with a relatively stable democracy and a growing middle class. Coffee and cocoa were its main exports, and rural communities played a key role in economic life. The discovery of oil in the early 20th century, particularly during the 1920s, transformed the nation. By the 1930s, Venezuela had become one of the world's leading oil exporters. This rapid shift created a massive influx of wealth and sparked urbanization, but it also started the country's dependency on oil. During the 1950s and 60s, Venezuela was considered a model for democracy and economic progress in Latin America. The country attracted immigrants from Europe, and its capital, Caracas, became a bustling metropolis. However, even then, cracks were forming. The wealth generated from oil was not evenly distributed, and rural areas lagged in development. To understand Venezuela's economic collapse, it's important to appreciate just how different things looked in the mid-20th century. During the 1950s, Venezuela had one of the highest per capita incomes in Latin America. It was dubbed the Saudi Arabia of South America. The country was relatively peaceful, politically stable, and even served as a refuge for immigrants fleeing post-war Europe and regional instability. Venezuela was also one of the founding members of OPEC in 1960, aligning itself with other oil-producing nations to coordinate petroleum policies and stabilize markets. Oil revenues became the cornerstone of its development plans. However, this easy influx of money masked the need for structural reforms and efficient governance. By the 1970s, President Carlos Andrés Pérez had launched a massive wave of nationalizations. The oil industry, iron, and steel sectors were brought under state control. Pérez used the sudden spike in oil prices following the 1973 oil crisis to fund ambitious infrastructure projects, education, and social programs. For a time, it worked. But these projects lacked long-term planning and were often riddled with corruption and inefficiency. The seeds of future instability were sown during this time. The wealth failed to trickle down evenly, and public expectations grew unrealistically high. When oil prices fell in the 1980s, Venezuela was left with massive debt, growing unemployment, and inflation. The government began borrowing heavily, leading to austerity measures that sparked civil unrest, most notably the Caracazo riots of 1989, where hundreds were killed during protests against rising fuel and transport prices. This period of turmoil paved the way for Hugo Chavez, a former military officer who had attempted a failed coup in 1992. By 1998, amid widespread disillusionment with the political elite, Chavez won the presidency, promising a Bolivarian revolution. He promised to redistribute wealth, empower the poor, and eliminate corruption. For decades, Venezuela enjoyed the benefits of high oil prices. In the 1970s, oil accounted for nearly 90% of the country's export earnings. During boom times, the government used oil revenues to fund generous social programs, subsidies, and public sector employment. It felt like a golden era. Poverty declined and access to education and healthcare improved. However, this growth wasn't built on a diverse or sustainable foundation. The booming oil sector led to a neglect of other industries like agriculture and manufacturing. This is the essence of the Dutch disease. The currency becomes stronger due to oil exports, making other exports less competitive internationally. Over time, domestic production declined, and Venezuela became dependent on imports for even basic goods. Chavez's policies initially brought measurable improvements. Poverty rates fell, literacy improved, and healthcare became more accessible. He launched programs known as misiones that aimed to bring social welfare to the poorest regions. However, these successes were largely underwritten by record-high oil prices, not structural economic change. Chavez significantly increased the role of the military in civilian affairs, stacked the judiciary with loyalists, and rewrote the constitution to expand presidential powers. He nationalized major industries including telecommunications, electricity, and agriculture. But these takeovers were often followed by steep declines in productivity. Rather than building up financial reserves or diversifying exports, Chavez used oil revenues to fund populist policies and subsidize neighboring countries with discounted oil. As long as oil prices were high, the system limped along. But when prices crashed in 2014, just a year after Chavez's death, his successor, Nicolás Maduro, inherited a fragile economy teetering on the edge. According to Transparency International, Venezuela consistently ranks among the most corrupt countries in the world. Billions of dollars in oil revenues disappeared due to mismanagement and embezzlement. Public infrastructure crumbled, and essential services like electricity and water became unreliable. With declining oil revenue and increasing debt, the government resorted to printing money to cover expenses. This led to hyperinflation. By 2018, inflation reached 1,698,488%, according to the IMF. Prices doubled every few days. People carried bags of money to buy a loaf of bread. Basic necessities like food, medicine, and toilet paper became scarce. Hospitals lacked supplies, and millions of Venezuelans faced malnutrition. The middle class was wiped out, and more than 7 million people fled the country in search of better living conditions, according to the UNHCR. While the economic problems began internally, international sanctions further aggravated the crisis. The US and other countries imposed sanctions targeting Venezuela's oil industry and top officials, citing human rights abuses and electoral fraud. These sanctions made it harder for the country to access global financial markets and trade. Although the government blames sanctions for the crisis, economists agree that the root causes lie in decades of poor governance, corruption, and overdependence on oil. Despite the grim situation, Venezuela still holds potential. The country is rich in natural resources, has a young population, and a strategic geographic location. But meaningful recovery would require massive economic reforms, debt restructuring, political stability, and anti-corruption measures. Several economists suggest liberalizing the economy, stabilizing the currency, and investing in non-oil sectors like agriculture and tourism. International aid and cooperation with multilateral institutions like the IMF and World Bank would also be essential. In recent years, Venezuela has seen signs of modest recovery. The government partially dollarized the economy, which helped stabilize prices and ease hyperinflation. In 2023, inflation dropped significantly compared to previous years, and the bolivar regained some of its value. However, the recovery remains fragile, uneven, and largely limited to urban centers. In short, oil made Venezuela rich, temporarily. But without diversification, good governance, and sound economic policies, the wealth turned into a trap. Prosperity is not just about what you have, but how wisely you manage it.